Oakland, California, October 28, 1967. It is almost dawn. The streets are the particular shade of dark that exists just before morning light arrives. The kind of dark where everything that happens feels like it happened in a different world than the one people wake up to. A young black man is driving through those streets when a police officer named John Frey pulls him over. Within minutes, shots ring out. When the gunfire stops, a police officer is lying dead on the cold pavement. Another man is staggering away from the scene, blood soaking through his shirt, a bullet in his stomach. By sunrise, the FBI's most wanted list will have a new name at the top. A name that will be chanted in streets across America. A name that will make the powerful genuinely afraid. A name that will appear on buttons, on posters, on banners held by thousands of people who had never met him but understood, in the way that people understand things that are bigger than individual facts, what his case meant. His name was Huey Percy Newton, and his story, the full story, not the version that gets told in documentaries that linger on the leather jackets and the firearms, is one of the most extraordinary American stories of the 20th century. A man who entered college functionally illiterate and taught himself to read using Plato's Republic, who studied law in the library to turn California's own statutes into a weapon against police brutality, who built a network of community programs that fed more hungry children than some government initiatives, who earned a PhD from UC Santa Cruz, who met with Chinese Premier Zhou, who was targeted by the FBI for decades, including for 18 years after his death. This is his story. And to tell it properly, we have to go back, way back, to a Louisiana parish where being black meant living with a target on your back. Before we go further, I want to take a moment and tell you why this story is on Hidden Black Files. Because Huey Newton is one of those historical figures whose image has been so carefully managed by his enemies, by the media, and sometimes by his own movement, that most people think they know his story when they've actually only seen a silhouette of it. The leather jacket, the shotgun, the raised fist, the FBI wanted poster. What they don't show you, the man who read Plato to teach himself literacy, the network of free clinics and breakfast programs and schools, the doctoral dissertation, the international diplomatic meetings, the documented government campaign to destroy everything he built. I started Hidden Black Files because I grew up learning history in pieces, and Huey Newton's story is one of the most incomplete pieces I ever received. The deeper I researched, the more I understood that the incompleteness was not accidental. They showed you the parts of his story that made him easy to dismiss. We're going to show you the rest. Subscribe to Hidden Black Files right now and hit the bell. If you believe these stories deserve to be told in full, this channel exists for you. Now, Monroe, Louisiana, 1942. While the world's attention was fixed on World War II, on the beaches of North Africa, the factories of Germany, the islands of the Pacific, Black Americans were fighting their own war. A war that had no declared end date, no allied nations, no prospect of a peace treaty. A war for survival in the American South. Monroe sits in Ouachita Parish, Louisiana. And if you were black in Ouachita Parish in the 1940s, you lived with the daily, concrete awareness that your life was considered disposable by the legal and social structures around you. Between 1877 and 1950, Ouachita Parish recorded 37 documented lynchings of black people, the fifth highest total in the entire American South. 37 people murdered by mobs, in an area smaller than most American cities. And those are only the ones that were documented. Here is a question worth sitting with, and we want you to answer it in the comments below. Did you learn about the scale of lynching in specific American counties in school? And if not, what do you think that omission cost you? This was the world Huey Percy Newton was born into on February 17, 1942. His parents named him after Huey Long, Louisiana's former governor, a populist whose complicated legacy included doing more for black education than any Southern governor before him. A name his parents hoped that might carry some protection. It wouldn't be enough. The Newton family made the decision that millions of black American families made in the same era. They left. Between 1916 and 1970, over 6 million black people fled the American South in what historians call the Great Migration, the largest internal movement of people in American history. And understanding what drove it requires understanding what they were running from. Not just the lynch mobs, though the lynch mobs were real, but the entire architecture of a system designed to make black advancement impossible. Jim Crow laws, legally enforced segregation, systematic voter suppression, economic arrangements that kept black workers permanently in debt, a legal system that was explicitly not designed to protect black lives. The South had constructed a prison out of law, custom, and violence. The Great Migration was the jailbreak. The Newtons landed in Oakland, California. But here is something that becomes clear the longer you study American racial history. Racism is not a regional phenomenon. It is a national one. It simply wears different clothes in different places. Oakland didn't have the same lynch mobs as Washita Parish, but it had its own systems for keeping black people in their place. Police brutality, discriminatory housing practices that pushed black families into specific neighborhoods and kept them there. A school system that, as Huey would later document in devastating detail, was designed to produce compliant workers rather than educated citizens. The Newton family was poor, but they were close. They moved constantly through the Bay Area, chasing affordable rent. But there was always food, always shelter, always the sense of a family holding itself together against significant external pressure. What damaged young Huey most was not poverty. It was school. Huey Newton wrote about his Oakland education in his autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, with the precision that is worth quoting carefully. During those long years in Oakland public schools, I did not have one teacher who taught me anything relevant to my own life or experience. Not one instructor ever awakened in me a desire to learn more, or to question, or to explore the worlds of literature, science, and history. All they did was try to rob me of the sense of my own uniqueness and worth, and in the process, nearly killed my urge to inquire. Read that again. The school failed to adequately educate him. They tried to rob him of his sense of uniqueness and worth. They nearly killed his urge to inquire. This was not academic underperformance. This was an institution operating exactly as designed to produce a black young man who knew his place, who did not ask questions, who did not develop the intellectual confidence that might make him dangerous to the existing order. And it nearly worked. Huey Newton graduated from Oakland Technical High School, functionally illiterate. He could read, after a fashion, but it was a struggle. He had completed 12 years of formal education, without acquiring the foundational skill that education is supposed to transmit. We want to ask you something directly, and we genuinely want your answer in the comments. If a school system consistently produces graduates who cannot read, is that a failure, or is it functioning as designed? What do you think? In 1959, Huey Newton enrolled at Merritt College, with a secret that would have gotten most people laughed out of the building. He could barely read. He could have accepted this, could have concluded that the system's verdict on him was correct, that he was limited, that his ceiling was low, that the education system's failure to teach him was actually evidence of his own inadequacy. Instead, he decided to teach himself. And the book he chose, this is the part that tells you everything you need to know about who Huey Newton actually was not a children's book, not a basic literacy primer. He chose his brother's copy of Plato's Republic, one of the most complex philosophical texts in the Western canon, a book that gives university professors genuine difficulty, a dialogue that has challenged educated readers for 25 centuries. He sat with that book and he worked through it, word by word, concept by concept, until it opened. The school system had decided Huey Newton couldn't learn. Plato disagreed. At Merritt College, Huey's path crossed with Bobby Seale, a fellow student, a fellow searcher, a man asking the same questions Huey was asking about why the world looked the way it looked and what, if anything, could be done about it. Their conversations ran long into the night. They read together. They argued together. They began to develop a shared analysis of the conditions they saw around them, in Oakland's neighborhoods, in the legal system, in the gap between what America claimed to be and what it actually was for Black people. Huey joined the Afro-American Association, an organization pushing for Black empowerment through education and political action. He was not a passive member. Working with other association members, he succeeded in getting Merritt College to adopt its first African American history course, a genuinely radical achievement in 1960s academia, when most university curricula treated African American history as either non-existent or marginal. But his education was happening on two tracks simultaneously. In the library, he was reading Karl Marx on class struggle, Vladimir Lenin on revolutionary theory, Frantz Fanon on the psychology of colonialism, Malcolm X on self-defense and dignity, Mao Zedong on guerrilla strategy, and Che Guevara on organizing resistance. He was building an intellectual framework capable of analyzing his own lived experience. And in the streets, in Oakland's pool halls and community spaces and neighborhoods, he was collecting the raw material that the books alone couldn't provide. Learning how the system actually operated against Black people, learning what the law said it would do and what it actually did, learning the gap between American ideology and American reality. He was synthesizing these two educations into something that had not existed before, and he was about to put it into action. Newton's relationship with the law had started early, before college, before the political education, before the revolutionary reading program. Growing up in Oakland, he had been arrested multiple times as a teenager. Gun possession, vandalism, the predictable encounters between a young Black man in a poor neighborhood and a police force that treated that neighborhood as a problem to be managed rather than a community to be served. In mid-1964, a confrontation at a party led to Newton stabbing a man named Odell Lee. Newton claimed self-defense, that Lee's body language and a movement toward his pocket suggested an imminent threat. The court didn't accept the argument. He served 6 months. But here is what Newton took from that experience, and from his subsequent study of criminal evidence law, that proved more important than the conviction itself. He had not known his rights, not in the abstract, theoretical sense. In the immediate, practical sense, when a police officer stopped him, when he was being questioned, when the legal machinery was operating around him, he had not known what the law actually said he was entitled to, and he began to understand that this ignorance was not accidental. It was produced. The legal system's complexity, combined with a public education system that did not teach Black people their rights, created a permanent vulnerability that law enforcement exploited systematically. Newton would spend years closing that gap. He wasn't going to be ignorant of the law again. By 1966, Huey Newton had his associate's degree, an intellectual framework built from years of intensive self-directed study, a direct education in how the legal system operated against Black communities, and a partner in Bobby Seale who shared his analysis and his urgency. The civil rights movement was in full swing nationally. Nonviolent demonstrations, sit-ins, freedom rides, the March from Selma to Montgomery, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, real achievements, real legislation, real changes in what the law said. And in Oakland, the police were still brutalizing Black residents with near total impunity. Newton and Seale had enormous respect for what the civil rights movement had accomplished, but they were watching their own community, right in front of them, in real time, being terrorized by a police force that the law changes hadn't reached. Neighbors trapped in poverty, families being harassed, beaten, sometimes killed by officers who faced no consequences. They were done asking politely. In October 1966, Newton and Seale founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. The name was precise, deliberate, not aggression, defense, and Newton was about to use the same intellectual determination that had unlocked Plato's Republic to find a legal weapon that would change the entire dynamic. He went to the law library. The same focus he had brought to Plato, the same refusal to be defeated by complexity, the same belief that understanding was available to anyone willing to do the work. He studied California's legal code with what Bobby Seale would later describe as going through it, quote, backwards, forwards, sideways, and catty corners. And he found it. California was an open carry state. Citizens could legally carry loaded firearms in public as long as they were not concealed. Most people didn't know this. Newton did. The Black Panther Party began armed patrols of Oakland's black neighborhoods. When police officers stopped a black resident, Panthers would arrive, standing at a legal distance, weapons visible, law books in hand, making sure those officers knew with absolute certainty that they were being observed. They would read the officers their own regulations, cite the specific provisions of California law that governed what police could and could not do, document everything. It was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, fighting the system with its own weapons. The police couldn't touch them. Newton had done his homework. Here is a question for the comments, and we want your honest answer. When you first heard about the Black Panthers, what image came to mind? And how does what you're learning now compare to that image? Where did the gap come from? If all you know about the Black Panther Party is the image the mainstream media constructed, young black people in leather jackets carrying guns, then you have been given a portrait designed to make you afraid of them rather than understand them. Here is what that image was designed to obscure. By 1971, the Black Panther Party had established over 60 community survival programs across the United States. 60. The Free Breakfast for Children program, which fed hungry children before school in cities across the country, was so effective that the FBI specifically identified it as a threat, not because it was violent, because it was popular, because it demonstrated that a black revolutionary organization could provide for its community better than the government could, and that realization was considered dangerous. But they didn't stop at breakfast. Free medical clinics in neighborhoods where doctors were reluctant to practice. Free sickle cell anemia testing at a time when the medical establishment largely ignored a disease that disproportionately affected Black Americans. A busing program to help families visit incarcerated loved ones. Legal education seminars teaching Black residents their rights. Housing cooperatives for families who couldn't afford rent. Their own ambulance service, because regular ambulances frequently refused to respond to calls in Black neighborhoods. And then there was the Oakland Community School. While the same public school system that had produced Huey Newton's functional illiteracy continued to fail Black children, the Panthers built their own solution. A school providing high-quality education to 150 children from Oakland's poorest neighborhoods. The man who had been failed by public education built a school. Think about that. The Panthers understood something that many political movements have failed to grasp. You cannot tell your own story if you depend on others to tell it for you. So they built their own media. The Black Panther Party newspaper became one of the most widely distributed African-American publications in the country. Every week, Panthers would hit the streets selling it for 25 cents a copy, not just in Oakland, but across the country. The paper covered community programs, political education, police brutality cases, international solidarity, and the broader analysis of why the conditions Black Americans lived in existed and who benefited from maintaining them. While mainstream media was photographing their guns, the Panther newspaper was documenting their schools. Here is something we want to put directly to you in the comments. The Panthers ran free breakfast programs, free clinics, and free schools. The FBI called these programs a threat to America. What does it say about a government when community building is treated as dangerous? Tell us what you think. 4:51 a.m. October 28, 1967. Officer John Frey spots what he identifies as a known Black Panther vehicle and calls in the license plate. The car has outstanding warrants, but they're not in Huey Newton's name. They belong to someone called Laverne Williams for parking violations. Frey pulls the car over. When he realizes the driver is Huey Newton, not Laverne Williams, he immediately calls for backup. Officer Herbert Hines arrives within minutes. What happened in the next several minutes on that Oakland street is one of the most contested sequences of events in the history of American civil rights law. By 5 a.m., shots have been fired. Officers Gilbert de Hoyos and Thomas Fitzmaurice respond to Hines's desperate call. When they arrive, Officer Frey is down with 4 bullet wounds. Hines is seriously injured with 3. And Newton is gone. At 5:50 a.m., Newton staggers into Kaiser Hospital with a bullet in his stomach. Dr. Thomas Finch and nurse Karen Leonard attend to him. According to their testimony, Newton is agitated and requires sedation to be treated. Within minutes, he is handcuffed to his hospital bed. The charge: murder of Officer John Frey. Here is where the legal case gets complicated, in ways that the prosecution would prefer to ignore. No gun is found on Newton or anywhere at the scene. Key witness testimony is riddled with contradictions. Hines claims the shooting began after Newton was already under arrest. Another witness claims Newton shot Frey with Frey's own weapon during a struggle. Newton himself maintains that Frey shot him first, causing him to lose consciousness during the incident. Without a weapon, without consistent witness testimony, without physical evidence directly linking Newton to the fatal shots, in September 1968, Huey Newton was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. 2 to 15 years. The system had made a miscalculation. It had taken the most visible leader of the most high-profile black revolutionary organization in America, subjected him to a trial that his own judge's documented bias made a mockery of, convicted him on contradictory evidence, and expected the movement to deflate. Instead, it created a rallying point that would prove more powerful than any single speech or program. On Newton's birthday, February 17, 1968, 5,000 people gathered in Oakland demanding his release. 5,000 people. On a birthday, for a man who had been convicted 4 months earlier. The Free Huey movement spread with a speed that surprised even the Panthers. Buttons, T-shirts, posters, rallies in cities across the country, an alliance with the Peace and Freedom Party, a majority-white anti-war organization that brought Newton's case to audiences who had no prior connection to the Black Panther Party. As Panther leader Kathleen Cleaver put it, they were creating a living martyr. Every day Newton remained imprisoned, his face on posters across America. The moral argument grew stronger. In May 1970, the California Court of Appeal overturned Newton's conviction. 2 subsequent trials ended in hung juries. The Alameda County District Attorney eventually dropped all charges. Huey Newton walked out of prison into an America where his name had become a symbol. The system had tried to make an example of him. It had made him legendary instead. By 1971, Huey Newton was ready to take the Panthers' analysis beyond American borders. In late September, accompanied by fellow Panthers Elaine Brown and Robert Bay, he traveled to the People's Republic of China, a 10-day journey that would send shockwaves through diplomatic circles on multiple continents. At every Chinese airport where Newton's plane touched down, organized crowds gathered to show support. They carried Mao's little red book and signs in English. "We support the Black Panther Party. Down with U.S. imperialism." But the public demonstrations were only the surface layer. The Chinese government arranged a series of high-level diplomatic meetings that placed Newton at the center of international revolutionary politics. Face-to-face discussions with North Korea's ambassador, strategic meetings with Tanzania's ambassador, critical conversations with delegations from both North Vietnam and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam. And then not one, but 2 personal meetings with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai himself. One of those meetings included Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing. The Chinese government was treating the Black Panther Party as a legitimate political force on the world stage, not a street organization, not a domestic criminal concern, a political entity worthy of the same diplomatic engagement extended to nation-states. Newton returned from China with a deepened sense of the Panther's place in a global struggle, and with an intellectual evolution that would continue to develop in directions that surprised even his closest allies. Here is something about Huey Newton that does not fit the image that was constructed around him, and we want you to reflect on this in the comments. The man who taught himself to read using Plato's Republic earned his PhD in social philosophy from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1980. His doctoral dissertation was titled War Against the Panthers, a Study of Repression in America. It was not an abstract academic exercise. It was a detailed, scholarly analysis of the federal government's documented campaign against the Black Panther Party, examining the assassinations of Fred Hampton, Bunchy Carter, and John Huggins, and the systematic use of federal law enforcement as a tool of political suppression. The man the FBI had characterized as a thug wrote a peer-reviewed dissertation about what the FBI had done to his movement. We want to ask you directly in the comments. Huey Newton went from functional illiteracy to a PhD. He taught himself to read using Plato and ended up writing a doctoral dissertation at UC Santa Cruz. What does his educational journey say about what's possible? And what do systems that produce functional illiteracy actually cost us? While Newton was building the community programs, building the international connections, building the intellectual framework, J. Edgar Hoover was doing something else entirely. He was running COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, the FBI's classified operation to, in Hoover's own documented words, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize Black political organizations. Not investigate, not prosecute crimes. Neutralize. COINTELPRO agents were not passive observers of the Panthers. They were active saboteurs. They planted informants at every level of the organization. They spread deliberate disinformation designed to create internal conflict. They orchestrated confrontations between different Black power groups, sometimes with fatal results. They conducted illegal surveillance. They shared intelligence with local police forces that were then used to conduct raids on Panther offices and homes. Fred Hampton, the 21-year-old Chicago Panther leader who had built one of the most effective community coalition programs in the city's history, was assassinated in his bed during a police raid in December 1969. Subsequent investigation revealed that the raid was conducted based on an FBI floor plan provided to Chicago police by an FBI informant, and that Hampton had been drugged before the raid through the same informant network. The United States government killed a 21-year-old in his bed while he slept. This is not conspiracy theory. This was documented in congressional investigations and acknowledged by the government. COINTELPRO was officially shut down in 1971 after activists broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and leaked the files to the press. The documents revealed the full scope of what had been done, not just to the Panthers, but to Martin Luther King Jr., to Malcolm X's organization, to virtually every significant Black political organization of the era. The FBI kept a terrorism enterprise investigation file on Huey Newton until 2007. He died in 1989. They investigated him for 18 years after his death. Here is where the story becomes more painful. Because the forces working against Huey Newton were not only external, and the remainder of his story demands the same honesty that the earlier parts do. In August 1974, a 17-year-old named Kathleen Smith was shot on an Oakland street. She died 3 months later. Prosecutors charged Newton. The primary witness, after someone attempted to assassinate her, refused to testify. 2 separate juries deadlocked. No conviction. That same year, Newton faced a charge of allegedly pistol-whipping his tailor over a billing dispute. Newton maintained these charges were fabricated, part of the documented campaign to destroy him and the Panthers. Given what COINTELPRO had done, Given what the FBI had done to Fred Hampton, given the documented history of using legal mechanisms to target black leaders, his suspicion was not paranoid. It was grounded, but it was also becoming harder to separate the documented government campaign from the genuine internal deterioration. The revolution was struggling under the combined weight of external suppression and internal conflict. The organization that had run 60 community programs was fracturing. The cocaine epidemic that was devastating black communities across America was reaching inside the Panthers. The man who had once stood at the center of an international movement was increasingly fighting personal battles that the movement could not absorb. In 1974, Newton fled to Cuba with help from an unlikely ally. Bert Schneider, the Hollywood producer behind Easy Rider, arranged what may be the most audacious escape in American civil rights history. He created a fictional film production company, announced a non-existent movie called The Big Cigar, supposedly starring Huey P. Newton, used the production as cover to move Newton to Cuba. For 3 years, Newton lived in exile, watching from a distance as the organization he had built continued to fragment. In 1977, he made a decision that shocked nearly everyone who knew him. He came back to face the charges, back to fight the system one more time. Some charges were dropped, others ended in acquittals. For a moment, it seemed like he might thread this needle the way he had threaded the needle after the 1967 shooting. Then, in 1982, Newton was accused of embezzling $600,000 in state funds intended for the Oakland Community School, the very institution that had been the crown jewel of everything the Panthers had built for children. The charges would persist for years, finally resolving in 1989, when Newton pleaded no contest to a single count of cashing a $15,000 state check for personal use. By then, the Black Panther Party had officially dissolved in 1982, torn apart by the combined forces of COINTELPRO's legacy and internal contradictions that the organization could not survive. The man who had once fed thousands of children, built schools, met with world leaders, and earned a doctorate, was now fighting addiction on the streets of the city where his revolution had begun. August 22, 1989. West Oakland, the corner of 9th and Center Street. Huey Percy Newton is 47 years old. An argument breaks out between Newton and a 24-year-old member of the Black Guerrilla family, a prison gang named Tyrone Robinson. Shots ring out. When police arrive at the scene, they find Newton lying on the pavement. No weapon on him, no weapon anywhere near him. In 1991, Robinson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life. He later revealed his motive with a candor that is almost unbearable to read. He wanted to make a name for himself in the gang. The man who had been the FBI's most wanted. The man who had met with Zhou Enlai. The man who had built schools and clinics and fed thousands of children. The man who had earned a PhD and written a doctoral dissertation about government repression. Died on a street corner, shot by someone who wanted to impress a prison gang. In August 1989, Oakland came to a stop. Inside Allen Temple Baptist Church, 1,300 people, filling every available space. Outside, another 500 to 600 standing in respectful silence, listening through speakers, rich and poor, young and old, people who had been in the original basement meetings in 1966, people who had been born after Newton went to prison, people who had eaten food from the free breakfast program as children, people who had received medical care from Panther clinics, people who had simply read his words and understood that something important had happened in Oakland that the history books were not going to capture honestly. One speaker said what many in that room were feeling. Martin Luther King taught us how to pray and how to arouse the conscience of our oppressor. Huey P. Newton taught us how to stand up to our oppressor. Today, the corner where Newton fell is marked as Dr. Huey P. Newton Way. In 2021, the city of Oakland erected a bronze bust near the site of his death. A recognition, however incomplete, that something significant had been lost on that street corner. In the archives of Stanford University, There is a collection that most people have never heard of. Huey Newton's unpublished writings. Dozens of essays, carefully crafted, intellectually rigorous, never shared publicly during his lifetime, covering a range of subjects that challenges the image of the man the FB I wanted you to believe in. Philosophical examinations of power and resistance. Deep analyses of political theology and liberation. Studies of evolutionary biology and its social implications. Detailed critiques of political economy and systemic inequality. The man who taught himself to read using Plato's Republic left behind an intellectual archive that scholars are still working through. His theories about community organization, about building alternative institutions rather than simply opposing existing ones, about resistance through creation rather than only confrontation, resonate with movements today in ways he could not have fully anticipated. Every community mutual aid organization operating in an underserved neighborhood is working, whether it knows it or not, from a blueprint that Huey Newton helped design. Every movement that asks why are we dependent on institutions that were not built to serve us is asking Newton's question. Every person who looks at a system that failed them and decides to build something better instead of waiting for the system to reform itself is channeling something Newton understood at 24 years old in a Merritt college classroom before he had the language to fully articulate it. Here is what Huey Newton's story actually is, stripped of the image management, both the image his enemies built and the image his movement sometimes built. It is the story of a child failed by a system designed to fail him, who refused the verdict, who taught himself to read with one of the hardest books ever written, because that was what was available, who studied law not in a law school but in a public library, because he understood that knowledge of the law was power, and the system depended on Black people not having it, who built, from almost nothing, in a city that was actively hostile to what he was doing, a network of community programs that fed children, provided health care, and created educational alternatives when the official institutions refused to serve his community adequately, who was targeted by the most sophisticated domestic intelligence operation in American history not because he was violent, but because he was effective, who earned a doctorate while the FBI was building a terrorism investigation file on him, who died on a street corner in the city where his revolution began, at 47 years old, in circumstances that reflected the combined weight of everything that had been done to him and everything he had not managed to overcome, and whose ideas about community, about resistance, about what it means to build rather than simply oppose, are still generating new movements, new organizations, and new questions about power and dignity in America. We want to end with a question that we genuinely want you to answer in the comments, because this is the question that Huey Newton's entire life forces us to confront. When a system produces a child who graduates from 12 years of school unable to read, and that child goes on to earn a PhD and build a movement that fed thousands, what does that tell us about the system? And what does it tell us about what we lose when we allow that system to go unchallenged? Drop your answer below. We read every comment. Before we go, this story is exactly why Hidden Black Files exists. I built this channel because I grew up learning history in fragments. Because Huey Newton's name appeared in my education alongside a photograph of a leather jacket and a shotgun, without a single word about the breakfast programs, the schools, the clinics, the PhD, or the government campaign that spent more resources trying to destroy him than most cities spend on public health. The incomplete story serves a purpose. It keeps you afraid of the wrong things and ignorant of the right ones. Hidden Black Files exists to close that gap. Subscribe, share this video, and tell someone who has never heard the full story of Huey P. Newton that it exists, that it is waiting for them, and that it is more extraordinary than anything the FBI's wanted poster was designed to communicate. If we don't tell these stories, they disappear, and the people who live them disappear with them. Hidden Black Files exists so that never happens.